In this lesson, we're going to be talking about types of variables. For our own purpose, we're going to be talking about two: dependent variables and independent variables. What's the difference between the two? A dependent variable is a variable that depends on other factors, variables to be what it is, to have its value. But independent variable doesn't depend on anything. Rather, it can be manipulated. In other words, you can change, you can assign a value to it, you can change it, but its value does not depend on anything. We shall see it in the text video. Types of variables, at least for our own purpose, we're going to just talk about two types. One is dependent variable. That means a variable whose value depends on or is influenced by the independent variable. Okay, that is, the value of the dependent variable depends on or is influenced by the values of the independent variable. A dependent variable also is a variable which can also be characterized as an outcome or result of a process. In other words, whatever interaction or manipulation or uh, process that takes place, the outcome will depend on those processes. That outcome is also known as the dependent variable. A dependent variable also is a variable whose value will change in response to any changes in the independent variable. So, as soon as the independent variable changes, the dependent variable will respond to that change. Now, a dependent variable is also a variable whose value can be measured as output or result. In other words, whatever the independent variable does interact with other elements, the dependent variable can be measured as the output of that process or the result of that process. This is a quick example of where you have a dependent variable. Let's take, for example, in a part-time job that pays $25.70 per hour, then a weekly income, since some companies pay to their employees on weekly basis, a weekly income will depend on the number of hours worked for that week. Yes, and this can be expressed in the form of an equation, which is A is equal to 25.7x. That is the equation that expresses the weekly income or amount of income one can earn in a week, where A is the total weekly amount and X is the number of hours worked. In this case, A is the dependent variable and X is the independent variable. Like we said, A is the result of the number of hours you work in a week. And the number of hours you work in a week depends on you. In other words, you can manipulate it. You work for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, or whatever number of hours of your choice. But then the total amount you earn in a week will depend on that. Then the next type of variable, I would say, is independent variable. An independent variable is a variable that does not depend on another variable to be of any value. In other words, it is on its own. However, it can be manipulated. In other words, it can be changed, or yes, manipulated. But the value does not depend on anything to be. That's why it says it can be manipulated. So, yes. So, generally, two types of variables we're going to be dealing with: dependent variable and independent variable. And like I explained before, here x is the independent variable because you can manipulate the number of hours you work in a week. It depends on your choice. But the number of hours you work in a week does not depend on any other variable. Well, if it does, then it becomes a different scenario. But in this case, the total amount you earn in a week depends on the number of hours you work. Dependent variable and independent variable.